Welcome to the Dude-Eronomy podcast, providing a male-centered, biblical, and relatable conversation about theology, thoughts, opinions on either topical or current events. Now, let's get into it. Welcome back for another episode of the Dude-Eronomy podcast. My name is Kurt.
And I'm Andrew.
How are you doing this week, Andrew?
It's busy. I've got a upcoming Africa trip in a week and a half or so, and so there's lots of prep for that. And I have to take a 16-hour flight that I've got to mentally prepare for. So it's good, but lots of emails back and forth. How are you?
Yeah, lots of stuff going on. I am getting prepared for my own overseas travel. I am going to Europe in 3 weeks, so we both have some upcoming travels, and we're going to try to do some interviews to fill out our episodes, have them keep coming out as we're often traveling and unable to record. The way I wanted to start this week is actually something we talked about last week. We were talking about what a parable is, and I mentioned about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Who are our neighbors?" And I was watching a baseball game, just sort of had it on in the background and was taking notes for this episode that we're talking about today. The He Gets Us ad campaign came on right behind the batters in that ad space, and it said, "Umps are our neighbors."
Oh, wow.
I
Interesting.
thought it was great. I thought it was great.
That's semi-convicting for me.
Yeah, right? Especially with football season coming up. We yell like the players or the coach or the refs can hear us, but 4,000 miles away.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Well, I didn't expect that.
I thought that was pretty funny. And we'll
It's
have
good.
to get, at some point, we'll have to get into your He Gets Us involvement in what
Sure.
you've done for them, and, where some people see them as a good for Christian culture and some people don't see it that way. So that'll definitely be an upcoming episode. But today we're going to talk about Christians on dating apps, Christian dating maybe in general, but mostly focused on what Christians do on dating apps, how dating apps can be helpful, harmful, maybe our experiences. We normally don't share notes, and we didn't again this week. And so I don't know if you have any experience on dating apps. I know we've talked offline about how you met your wife.
Yeah.
You met sort of through happenstance of mutual friends, it sounds like. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear sort of your initial thoughts.
Yeah, I do have experience both with free versions of different sites, but also paying, because, you pay a certain fee and you can get access to more things that they offer, or more of the things that they offer, I should say, sometimes. So I had an all right time. I was thinking about my experience. Get used to being ghosted. If you haven't.
Interesting.
I think it's just so easy to just move on because you're not that relationally connected, or maybe the other person isn't. And so it's easy to just get rid of the person, but it can get pretty exhausting and also take up a lot of your time. If you give a lot of thought to it, it can occupy your thought space, and then you're starting to look at it all the time, and you're getting likes or hearts or whatever the app gives you. There's different things for every different app. But yeah, it was interesting. I had a couple good conversations with people. I think I had just one actual date, and that turned into a small dating relationship, but nothing ended in marriage with that. But yeah, like you said, I did meet my wife through mutual friends. So that was my experience. What about you?
Well, I want to say first that I think apps in general are sort of a losing proposition for men. And I say that specifically because I guess you could say the same thing for women, but what I have gathered from friends and other people speaking about app culture is that women get bombarded with a lot of different men, and a lot of men don't get much activity at all. And so it makes me think of the Pareto rule, Pareto, Pareto principle, which is the 80-20 rule, which says that with many outcomes, roughly 80% of the consequence come from 20% of the causes. And there are other applications for 80% of people doing 20% of the work and vice versa. And so I sort of feel like the Pareto principle applies to dating apps in that 80% of women are liking 20% of the men, and
Mm,
80% of the men don't have, much happening. So that's sort of been my experience with not only myself, but talking with other people. And I've met two women that I've dated in the past on dating apps. So I'm not necessarily knocking them, but I
mhm.
just, in general, and I'm still on them, frankly. So
Sure.
it's not like I'm poo-pooing them at all. It's just an interesting way that we're socializing now. And that also, it also comes with a lot of connotations. Obviously, like in the secular culture, it's a lot more freewheeling. And yeah, so I think we are, it's sort of unfortunate that this is the way that we meet people, because
Right.
if you're not having success, it's like, well, like this is how everyone is meeting people.
Hmm.
My best friend who lives just a little bit south of where I am, he was a former roommate, and while we were roommates, he matched online with a lady from Maryland all the way across the country. He had left his like radius of search at like everyone, and it was like a very small niche app. And so he was like matching with people from across the country, and they hit it
Right.
off, and now they're married.
It,
Things like that definitely happen. I remember
yeah.
a guy that I was in a community group with. He met his wife who was Norwegian, and he was here in Oregon. So, things like that
Right.
definitely happen. I think it can absolutely be a good place if it's used properly.
Right. Well, it's just like with any technology or even take social media. I mean, it can cause a lot of bad things, but it can be redeemed in many ways. And if you go into it with the right heart and the right expectations, are walking with God in a secure way, and that's your number one purpose and focus is your relationship with the Lord. That's obviously a huge prerequisite to any dating, I would say, if you're following Christ. But one of the things I did to prepare for this was I found a 2023 Pew Research on dating site and app usage, and wondering if we could just respond to some of these things, if you don't mind.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so some main takeaways I found was that 3 in 10 U.S. adults say they have used a dating app or site, which I guess that's about right. Does that sound about right to you? 3 in 10 U.S. adults.
That sounds really low to me. I
Hmm.
mean, an adult can be anyone 18 or
Right.
95 or older,
I
so I would assume that
Yeah.
I would love to see that distribution of who they
Sure.
asked and the ages they asked. I think if you were to ask 20 to 40, I
Hmm.
think if it came out as 3 and 10, I would assume that a lot of people were just still not able to say like, yeah, I used a dating app, because it used to have a
Sure.
bad connotation with like, oh, like you're hopeless and you don't have any other prospects, so you chose to go
Hmm.
online. It used to have a really bad reputation. If people said 3 and 10 and it was only 20-year-olds to 40-year-olds, I would think that that was way, way low.
Yeah, no, and it does, and there is detailed. I didn't get into the weeds of the whole thing. They have graphs and everything on the
Sure.
website. Yeah, it definitely does taper off when it goes to older people. It said that 1 in 10 partnered adults, so that's not just marriage partners, that's people in long-term relationships. 1 in 10 partnered adults met their current significant other through the dating site app, and 1 in 5 couples under 30 did. So that's a little higher.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Interesting.
yeah, there's a couple more. More people use Tinder than any other, followed by Match and Bumble. You have OkCupid, eHarmony, and Hinge, which I thought Hinge was low. I remember using Hinge back in the day, a few years ago. Women are likely to feel overwhelmed. This is something you may have noted earlier. Women are
Yeah.
likely to feel overwhelmed by a number of messages, while men tend to, feel insecure about the lack of messages, just because there's a difference in ratio, right?
Yeah, and I think in general that just sort of speaks to who men and women are, and we're made
Sure.
uniquely and differently in God's eyes. And I think women are more choosy about who they want as a partner. I mean, if you look at it from, And I still sort of look at life through a sort of an evolutionary lens. I don't necessarily know that evolution has fully been explained well enough, but I
Hmm.
do think that from sort of a biological standpoint, men chose as many partners as they could get to sort of spread their seed and their offspring, and
Hmm.
women wanted security and comfort. And so I
Hmm.
think women and men definitely look at dating differently. And so I think that Pareto
Yeah.
principle really does apply that, or sorry, 80% of women are looking at 20% of the men.
Yeah, and it's gonna. I think it's only gonna grow. I mean, as we were just talking about before, a greater ratio of young people interacting and using it, just because they can use their phones easier. They know how to get around interfaces, and they're used to apps where it might be a little harder for older people. But I think it's just gonna grow. I mean, the last stat I'll shoot at you is 4 in 10 adults say online dating has made their search for a long-term partner easier. So I think it's only going to grow, and it blows me away when a new dating site comes up and is created because I'm like, can they create something new and different? But it seems like they do. So I mean, innovation at its finest, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, some apps have like 7 people on it, and you sign up, and
That's
it's like
true.
that. Well, that's very underwhelming. Like the nearest person to me is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay, well,
Right.
but sort of the little known secret about the app culture is that a lot of the apps are owned by the same parent company, which I
Mm.
think is called Match Group. I
Yeah.
could be wrong about that, but if you look up Match Group, yeah, it's sort of the Wikipedia says it's an American internet and technology company headquartered in Dallas, Texas. It owns and
Mm.
operates the largest global portfolio of online dating services, including Tinder, Match, Meetic, OkCupid, and others. So, yeah, Match Group has a ton of market share of. So it's just kind of interesting to note where all this innovation is coming from. It's sort of a lot of it's coming from one place, but yeah, I think some of the apps, I mean, definitely like Tinder is definitely geared towards quick sexual encounters and obviously is not something that Christians should be seeking. I
Sure.
actually have a couple of examples that I wrote about in 2018 if you want to sit tight and hear what I said back in November of 2018.
Yeah. Shoot it.
I had a blog. I don't really maintain it. It's called Proverbs 31 Man. And I wrote back in November of 2018 about 2 stories that I came across. And from a Christian perspective, the place that I was, I could just sort of see through this bigger story and just be like, dang, like if the Christian ethic was just applied to these situations, none of this tragedy would have had to happen. And I do have to warn you guys, these next couple stories are relatively gruesome. So if you need to come back in the next maybe 5 minutes and we'll be
Hmm.
we'll be back on the subject of that. But I think this story needs to be told because we talk about dating apps and what a lot of apps are used for, but I think it's important to understand why Christians have this ethic about sexuality. And
Hmm.
these 2 stories are just an example of why. So again, this is November 2018. Story number one: 8 people from one family were murdered at 4 different locations in small towns in southern Ohio in 2016. So that was 2 years before I wrote this. That week in November 2018, 2.5 years after, and with the largest death investigation in the history of the state of Ohio, 6 people from another family were arrested for the involvement. 4 were charged with murder, and 2 were charged with perjury and forgery. The
Hmm.
reason the Ohio Attorney General, Mike DeWine, who I believe is a senator in Ohio now, or he may be the governor, I think he's the governor, said, quote, custody of a child plays a role in this case. The youngest suspect had 1 and possibly 2 children with one of the deceased. So the youngest suspect had 1, maybe 2 children with the person from the other family whose whole family was killed. They conceived their first child when she was 15 years old, and he was also charged with unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, in creating that child. Second story: Lauren McCluskey, 21-year-old student at University of Utah, was killed by an ex-boyfriend she had dated for just a month. The man lied about his name, age, and that he was actually a 37-year-old registered sex offender who spent 10 years in prison for enticing a minor online. After they broke up, he and his family harassed Lauren for several days, culminating in him demanding she give him $1,000 to keep explicit photos of her off the internet. Ultimately, he kidnapped and killed her. of these two stories, when I first heard of the arrest, I immediately thought, geez, if these people knew and followed the words of the Bible, they wouldn't be in this position to let this happen at all. And in story two, the connection obviously was after they broke up. He had explicit pictures of her. They only dated for a month. So ultimately, it seems like he was obsessed with her, kidnapped and killed her. So again, I thought, geez, if only this young woman knew and followed the words of the Bible, she wouldn't have been in this position to have this happen to her. But I stumbled upon an obituary that made mention that she was a Christian. And I thought, man, I really hope that she accepted and followed Jesus and this was just an aberration. But the reason I share these stories is as a cautionary tale because we are all sinners attempting to follow Jesus, but the culture in the world is continuously and will continue to creep into the Christian culture. And ultimately, sexual desire was the linchpin for both of these stories. And without that, these stories wouldn't have had oxygen for the fire to burn.
Mm. Wow. Well, in a conversation about dating apps, talking about murder and potential issues like that, it's definitely a turnoff. But
Yeah, I
wow.
mean, yeah, obviously be careful, but I think it's the sexual desire of these people that played out in a non-Christian way. And you know
Sure.
that second story of Lauren McCluskey, she was a track athlete at University of Utah, and I believe one or both of her parents worked at Washington State University, which is where my parents went. And she was
Mm.
born and raised in Pullman, Washington, which is just a small little college town that I absolutely love. My parents met there, so without Pullman, you know, I wouldn't be here. But, you know, that one really hit home because she's just sort of a small town girl and, you know, moved to Utah for college and this awful thing happens to her. But
Mm.
yeah, it goes to show you that we really can be captured by what the culture is telling us and telling us. Like I said last episode, you know, I went to college thinking that college was going to be what Hollywood told me college
Mm.
was going to be. And
Right.
I came out of a small liberal arts college knowing Jesus, which is, you know, not exactly the normal story.
It's not the norm, but definitely God's grace in that moment. But yeah, I think when I was just listening to you talk about that, I was thinking about Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 10, you know, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. And if you're listening to this and you're wondering if you should go into a dating app and start seeking it out that way, I think that's something you definitely have to pray about and assess your heart and what you're really trying to get and what your desires are, right? You need to have a good mentor, talk to someone, don't just bottle it up. I think community is really important in finding a spouse. You shouldn't be doing it in isolation from the church. Yeah, those are some of the things that I would just spout off initially. I don't know if you would want to add to those.
I think that apps can certainly be helpful, and I do have ways that being a Christian on a dating app can be helpful. And there are some Christian apps that are honestly just pretty awful. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, again, there you have no way to talk to anyone unless you pay money, and
Right.
even then, it's like they sort of entice you. And this is another sort of dirty secret of the dating app industry is that a lot of times, if you're a free member and you're still able to talk to people, they will sort of jack up your likes and your like, hey, you have a new message waiting, but you have to pay to see it. They do that intentionally to sort of draw you in. And actually, it's either a docu-series or a documentary film about Ashley Madison, which was a
Oh,
dating site that was created for having affairs.
right.
And they actually had a lot of their information leak out. And so people were like, oh, who's on this site? We can see which people like Hunter Biden was on the site and some well-known Christian bloggers were on the, or not the bloggers, but the husband of this blogger team was on the website. And that news came out when they were across the country in Seattle at a
Mm.
YouTube
Oh
vlog
yeah.
conference.
Mm-hmm.
And they got caught like in the middle, like all these people who are famous for being on YouTube and recording everything are in their face recording them like, hey, what's happening? What's this? And like, aren't you
Right.
guys Christians? And Ashley Madison also got in trouble because they would tell people like they essentially had bots on their program. So they would say like you have four messages and they would sign up so they would pay money. These bots would completely not make sense. They would never be able to meet up. And essentially it was just engineers at Ashley Madison that were just sort of talking to these lonely dudes and sort of leading
Wow.
them on about the fact that they had this match who was really attractive, and so they really suck people in. At least Ashley Madison. That's one story, but I do feel
Right.
like other apps for sure sort of puff up, or it's like you have a match and it's like, oh, she's from Romania. And it's like, well, okay. For some people that may work. For me, it's like, oh, okay, well, this person's in the
Right.
Philippines. Like, how that's not
Right.
really
I mean
helpful.
that I think the trope for that, or the stereotype for that, is like 40 or 50-year olds that are going through a midlife crisis, and they go and get a bride from a different country, and that's how they can get into the
Mm,
country, get their visas or whatnot, or
yeah.
citizenship.
One thing that I would say about dating apps is that whether it is sort of the more racy ones like Tinder or Bumble, I mean, Hinge, I think has a better reputation, but
Hmm.
it still can be used in a sexual secular way.
Oh
But
yeah.
apps that I like the most are ones that you can filter by what religion you want to see.
Right.
So then you've sort of set a bar that the minimum requirement for you is that these people say that they're Christian. Now, in their profile, they may say something deeper, like Jesus is the most important thing in my life. Like, that's great. But if you just pass that Christian bar, and even if they don't say anything in their profile, it sort of is a sign that they don't say anything. But if they don't, what I usually like to ask is, on your profile that you're Christian, what does that mean to you? And
Oh
usually
yeah.
from their answer, you can get a pretty good response as to what Christianity means for them, or what their
Hmm.
relationship with Jesus is. Or, I went until I was in high school, and then after college, I sort of fell away because I didn't wasn't forced to go with my parents, and I haven't really gone, but I still sort of believe. And that is sort of a wishy-washy answer that you may want to avoid. I'm not telling anyone they have to, but it may be wise or prudent to just sort of have someone that's on the same page as you
Hmm.
theologically, and as far as their faith, how they want to raise their kids. If that's something that's, of utmost importance to you, which it should be,
Right.
I think it's tough to sort of justify not having someone who is sort of half in.
I would lean into that too. I'd say if you're going to go into that space, you need to be honest early and go deep early, meaning you're asking those deeper questions. You're not taking things at face value, just accepting that they're Christian, and then you go in and they clearly aren't, after they don't have the same values or goals as you, as a follower of Christ. I think you need to push in, and especially with just how the word Christian is used today, it's so cultural, and it really could mean anything, as you stated.
Oh man. I mean, maybe you've come across this too, but I've come across a lot of wild things and some wild stuff that people have said that they're Christian, but they're like, I'm married and I'm in a poly relationship, and but then they mark themselves as Christian. I've seen that. I've seen people who you like say they're bisexual, but they're Christian, or they say that, just all sorts of other things. And it's like, my goodness, like, yeah, so you're right. You're absolutely right. The definition of what a Christian is has been expanded to what I would say is things that are outside of the Bible. That's why I think that question is like, what does being a Christian mean to you? You gave
Mhm.
yourself that label. What does that mean to you? It's an easy question to ask, but I also think it'll get you usually a decent answer, and you'll be able to tell pretty quickly how that fits into your life and your own faith.
Yeah, I agree. Someone that is following Christ will have an answer to that will mean something. It's not going to be a superficial answer. That's your biggest red flag.
I mean, I guess I could say more about my app history. I mean, I've been on apps for a while. Again, I've had some luck with them, but largely not really.
Hmm.
I honestly feel like I'm in that 80% of guys that don't get a lot of action. I should say activity, because like action and
Yeah,
apps sort of,
I
yeah.
was gonna say, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, not a ton of activity, but it's really funny because I always get in these seasons where there's like three or
Hmm.
four different people that I match with over the course of a couple weeks, like they're all at the same time. It's really strange, and I'm just sort of coming out of one of those where I had like three people at once, and I'm like, oh my gosh, how is this going to happen? And then one sort of gave that mishmash answer
Right.
about how, I'm not really in a church, and eventually I was just like, yeah, I don't think that's gonna work. Another one was like, hey, I'm talking to someone else, and so I feel like that's sort of how they sort of come in bunches, and then yeah, my experience has been maybe not normal. I don't honestly know, but I really do like a couple of apps that I have. One is Upward, which is sort of a Christian specific dating app, and Hinge is the other one that I do use.
Do you, when you're experiencing those seasons of multiple responses, do you find that Christian dating takes you on like an emotional roller coaster more than like regular like in-person dating, or it, what's
Um,
your experience there?
it can. There are some people that, I mean, to their credit, like I have a sister, I would be very protective of her also. So I would never fault a woman for doing due diligence or having an extended period of not meeting up. But I'm also of two minds because a lot of women are like, please set up a date and let's talk rather than just talking through our phones. And then other people
Sure.
are like, I need your social security number and I need to do a background check.
Oh
And
wow.
I understand that. I've never been asked for my social security number, but essentially they're asking a ton. And yeah, there's one person recently who I was like, okay, yeah, this is going all right. Do you want to meet? And she's like, oh no, I still have questions to ask you. And I'm like, okay. And so she's asking like, how many siblings do you have, and all these things. And I'm like, at some point, I'm like, well, our first date's going to be really boring because we've already answered all these
Sure.
underlying questions. But yeah,
Right.
so anyway, yeah. What was your experience like? You said you met someone who you dated for a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that was even off of like someone on Twitter I found was like kind of being a matchmaker. And I was like, what the heck? I think I had just come off of a couple failed dates. And so I went through that and actually met this girl. And she lived in Oregon when I was living in British Columbia, but I was able to, even met her parents and stuff, came down here on a visit. Yeah, it just didn't end up turning into anything. I think there was just too much distance and I wasn't ready to have a long distance serious relationship at that time. So, but yeah, it was a learning experience. I've had mostly positive experiences over negative, which I guess I'm thankful for that. I know it's not a universal truth, but yeah, I'm glad to be obviously married now to my wife. Hope I don't ever have to use a dating app, again. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I
I
yeah,
don't.
I wish I was in your shoes to be honest. But do you think you fell into that 80% of men that didn't get a ton of activity, or were there seasons that were pretty dry as far as getting matches and things?
When I was really into it, I really poured a lot of energy into it, and so that was kind of reflected in the responses that I got. But I felt like I went on spurts. Like I went in like for a month or two and was really active for a while, and then had a date or something. It crescendoed into something, and then either was good or bad, and I just left it for a little while. Yeah, it was a little bit of both, but like I said, yeah, it's mostly positive. Which I mean, I guess that's what I came to this talk to, kind of display that using a dating app as a Christian guy is not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that you aren't taking being single seriously or that you're discontent in some sinful way with your singleness. I think it's okay to explore different ways to find a marriage partner and just do it wisely.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, we talked about some of the negative aspects of dating apps, and we can maybe get into another episode that maybe digs a little deeper into sort of the Christian sexual ethic and why it is that we
Mm-hmm.
have it. We highlighted two stories of sort of outcomes that didn't necessarily spring from dating apps, but secular culture. And I think we can take lessons from that and being safe and being responsible about who we filter out. I mentioned this a while back, but I talked about filtering out who says that they're Christian. I
Right.
find that a lot easier than you see someone at the grocery store. It's like, well, there's like in the Portland area, there's like a 7% chance that they're Christian. So I
Mm-hmm.
find that just a lot easier to say, like, okay, these are the people that I have to choose from rather than, oh, there's someone at the bookstore. Are they? Aren't they? Like, should I find out? Should
Sure.
I take the energy to even figure it out?
Right.
Yeah, I think we can leave it there. We appreciate you guys listening in. Thanks for listening to the Dude-Eronomy podcast. Come back next week and we'll have another hot topic for you.
Thanks, guys. Hope you have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Dude-Eronomy podcast. If you want a question answered or have a topic for an upcoming show, email us at dude-eronomypod@gmail.com or find us on Instagram at dude_eronomy. And we'll catch you next week.